Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, the U.S. Secretary of State's visit to China cleared the air between the two countries. Antony Blinken is in Beijing for a two-day visit, and there's a lot for the two sides to talk about, from spying on each other to sanctions to war games to Taiwan and a whole lot more. It is not likely that in 2 days these issues can be cleared, but is it possible that the two sides can come closer in trying to resolve these issues? Is there a will on both sides to do so? Well, stay with us as we'll take a look at all of this and more on this Spotlight. I'd like to welcome my guests to this program. Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst out of Raleigh, North Carolina. And Ken Hammond, professor of East Asian and Global History, New Mexico State University out of Boston. Thank you both for being with me. Well, let's start off with Ray. Good to see you. Ray, what is your opinion about why this trip is taking place right now?
Well, curiously enough, it comes exactly 2 years and 2 days after Biden and Putin had their face-to-face summit in Geneva, June 16, 2021. At that meeting, Blinken and Sullivan had advised President Biden that China and Russia were enemies that would hate each other forever. They were learning out of textbooks that I participated in writing 3 decades before. They were not acquainted with the new correlation of forces. And so what we know about that meeting is that Joe Biden bragged about telling Putin, now it's inappropriate to say exactly what I told him, but they've got a long thousands of mile border with China, and they know that China wants to be not only the supreme economic, but the supreme military power in the world. Beijing is crushing. The word was Russia is being squeezed by China. Now, the next 2 years were devoted by Xi Jinping and Mr. Putin to demonstrating that that was 180 degrees wrong. And now we have a situation where the denouement is coming in Ukraine. And I believe this visit is a function of the U.S. trying to say, well, can we at least get the Chinese back into a decent relationship with us? We've given up on the Russians, but we sure don't want to face a two-front war. Can we start talking again? That's what they're afraid of. They're crazy. That's Putin's word, to even think about a two-front war, South China Sea, Taiwan Straits, Ukraine.
Okay, interesting thoughts. What about that, Ken? Do you think that that's going to be part of the talks, trying to prevent a two-front war? Because when we look at how aggressive the United States has been in dealing with China, it's quite interesting, especially when they're dealing with Russia in the way they are. Your perspectives on that?
Yeah, I think that the most optimistic read on Secretary Blinken's visit right at this time is that perhaps there have been some calmer heads beginning to express themselves in Washington and at the Pentagon. And this may be an indication that the United States is trying to lower the level of provocation and aggression that they have been pursuing towards China and try to adopt a position that is a little more, I won't say conciliatory, but at least trying to open these lines of communication. That would be the most optimistic read. And I think that probably wishing to avoid a two-front war, wishing to avoid really just catastrophic overextension of America's declining power is probably part of the calculus of this. But I think that, as with American policy overall, what's most important is to pay attention to what the country is doing rather than what the politicians are saying. So I think that obviously expectations for this visit have been kept very low on the American side. The Chinese, I think, are making good gestures to try to keep the door open for discussion, even as they've recognized that there's been a lot of double talk and back dealing on the part of the Americans, who often tend to say one thing and do quite another.
Well, Ray, why do you think that Washington has continued to flex its muscles up until now when it comes to China? I mean, both of you had said trying to avoid now perhaps a two-front war. But up until this time, the U.S. has been very, very aggressive. I mean, why have we seen that, especially this year?
Well, I would associate myself at some peril with Vladimir Putin's remarks at Valdai in October of last year. He was asked a question in the Q&A, President Putin, why do you think the Americans are taking on China at the same time they're taking on us in Ukraine? Can you figure that out? And Putin, I've memorized his answer. Putin says, well, I tried to analyze this logically, but it doesn't parse. They're crazy, Putin's words. I thought there was some subtle logic to this maybe, but I no longer think so. I think it's pure arrogance and a feeling of impunity, period, end quote. Now, I happen to agree, and certainly the Chinese have had their dosage of arrogance and a feeling of impunity from the very first meeting in Anchorage 2.5 years ago with Blinken and Nod and Sullivan. And so I think that's what it is, arrogance, a feeling of impunity. But it doesn't matter what McGovern thinks. What matters is what Putin thinks. And just look at him talking to his generals and saying, my God, that these people are a little crazy, maybe not a little, they're crazy. We have to prepare ourselves accordingly.
Is it that they're crazy, Ken, or is there some kind of strategic positioning going on that perhaps the average person is not getting, not really understanding what the United States is after? When we see, for example, sending fleets near China, being quite confrontational. Your overall thoughts? I mean, this is something that you have studied in dealing with. How do you assess this?
Well, I think that when we talk about China and Chinese politics and Chinese international relations and all this, we always have to remember that China's political culture tends to have a much longer time horizon than that of the United States. And so I think they're able to understand what's going on in the world in a way that's a lot more clear-eyed than the politicians in Washington. America has been, certainly the preeminent power in the world, certainly since the fall of the Soviet Union, and in many ways, certainly in the capitalist world since the end of World War II. And American elites, both economic and political, have grown used to having a world in which they could basically do pretty much what they wanted. But that world is passing away, and we are moving from an era of kind of unipolar dominance into a much more nuanced, geopolitical set of relationships. And those American elites are very fearful of this. And so I think that they perceive China as the power that will become preeminent in the coming era. And I don't think that that's entirely a misreading. Certainly, given its position in terms of population and economy, and it's clearly going to be a very important force in global affairs. And so American elites have kind of targeted China as their principal adversary. And I'm afraid that they have pursued their objectives there in a very reckless and dangerous way by these kinds of provocative actions, whether it's in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait or the demonization, this sort of relentless drumbeat of accusations and implications directed towards China, in an effort to slow down or perhaps even derail China's re-emergence into a significant player in global affairs. But that's really a fool's errand. The changes taking place in the world today are deep structural changes in global relations, in economic relations, and we're simply not going to turn the tide back on that. So in many ways, I think that the United States has been shooting itself in the foot and kind of poisoning the well for future relations in a more multipolar world. And perhaps some people are starting to have at least an initial understanding of that, and maybe trying to back off from that a little bit. But we will have to see what the practical implications of this visit are. Will there be any changes in policy? Will there be a lowering of the level of provocation? I'm skeptical about that, but I think that we'll have to bide our time and see where this goes.
Well, Ray, following up on what Ken has said, I mean, China has already surpassed the United States in many areas and even will soon surpass it economically. Do you think that the elite of the United States has it in them to be able to accept this? Or is it that they're even willing to create a war to try to impede China's progress and perhaps hide the reality of them not really being able to keep pace with Beijing?
That's really a very good question. But if you start out from the premise that they're crazy, that they're arrogant, that they still think and they can make their will felt throughout the world, I'm fearful of the right answer to that. Now, the question is whether Xi Jinping will agree to meet with Blinken in the first place, and whether his opposite numbers will say, look, Tony, it's over. If you think you're exceptional, if you're going to act like you did when we met together in Anchorage in March of 2020, forget about it, okay? Forget about it. You're not exceptional anymore. And once you agree that you're not exceptional, then maybe you can take a look at our approach, the Chinese approach. It's a long-term approach, and it's this, really simply, okay? There's a certain amount of resources in the world. There are lots of people vying for it. Why can't we just get along? Why can't we have how about this? How about a win-win rather than a confrontation from a dying empire? Think about it, Tony. Think about it, because that's the only solution that's going to work. And besides, you're not going to have any success in Ukraine. On the off chance you have some success, we're going to stand up and help our virtual ally, Russia. You can expect some saber rattling, at least in the South China Sea, perhaps even in the Taiwan Straits.
Well, what about that, Ken? I mean, really, again, when we look at it logically or on paper, one would think that actually the United States would take an approach of trying to work with China. Both are world powers, obviously, economically. We understand as far as the United States and China and the relationship they have economically. Why wouldn't they want what would be best for their own people? Because this would be in the interest of the American people and the United States itself. So should we just go back to Ray's premise and saying basically they're just crazy, or are we dealing with something else here?
Well, I think there's no question that there are deep problems facing the world today, not just one country or another, but we face existential crises in the environment with climate change, global warming, all of these things that are going to continue to unfold in the coming years. We still have very profound structures of inequality, exploitation, poverty around the world, which the industrial core capitalist countries in the West have done very little to address, while China has at least begun, as it has been trying to raise its own people out of poverty very successfully, has begun to try to develop new models of assistance, new models of international development that are more interactive, more win-win, as Ray says, and that will be mutually beneficial rather than simply being exploitive and extractive. For the American people, of course, to be part of this new world, this world, as the Chinese like to say, of shared prosperity, of mutual benefit, would clearly be in the best interest of the vast majority of American people. The problem, again, is that we're dealing with a powerful elite, an elite based on their ownership of wealth and their control of production, their position in the economic high ground. And they want to hang on to that. They have enjoyed power and privileges for a long time, and they're reluctant, to say the least, to surrender those, to let go of those. And they become rather desperate, and that desperation is what's dangerous. So I certainly embrace the idea that there's an arrogance of power that is it's sort of a disease with the American ruling class, and we're not yet seeing, I think, any substantive indications that they're willing to forego that. What they should be doing, obviously, and there are some sort of rote gestures toward this, is finding ways of cooperation, finding the path of mutual benefit, of shared development and prosperity. But at this point, if you read through the statements that the State Department released and the Chinese Foreign Ministry released, there's such a gulf in the presentation. Blinken is still talking about maintaining an open global system and the international rules-based order. These are the same. This is the same rhetoric that they trotted out in Anchorage. These are the same, lines that have been used to justify continuing to perpetuate American predominance and power in the world. That international rules-based order is a set of rules made up by the United States and imposed on the rest of the world. And of course, China doesn't want to maintain that, because that has been a system that has been adverse for them. And they're looking for a world of mutual benefit and shared development. So I think that there's still such a gulf between the interests of the elites and the real substantive interests of American people. And it would be so much better for us, for the American people, to find ways to work directly with not just China, but with people around the world to pursue that better future.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ray, are we likely to see a situation such as we're witnessing right now with NATO, Ukraine, and Russia, where the results ended in war, this flexing the muscle, and now what the United States is trying to do with Japan and South Korea in countering China? I mean, your thoughts on that side of things?
Well, I find it highly ironic, for example, that John Kirby, the National Security Council's spokesperson, would say, "We are very worried and concerned about Chinese activities in the Western Hemisphere." There were those reports about China and Cuba and all this kind of stuff. We've been concerned since day one with Chinese activities in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, well, I could just see Xi Jinping saying, "Hey, Blinken, we're very concerned with U.S. activities in the Eastern Hemisphere." I mean, it doesn't parse. I'd like to pick up on one thing Ken said, and that is climate change. The Chinese have shown themselves willing to make some sacrifices for that. The West not. And I label climate change as the mother of all opportunity costs on Ukraine. I mean, we were haltingly getting to a point where the whole world could cooperate on this thing, which needs whole world cooperation, and then came Ukraine. So, it has its costs that go far beyond what happens in Ukraine. The height of irony and the paradox, as John Mearsheimer describes it, is that on the off chance, and this is, I judge it as 10%, that Russia is pushed back out of Ukraine, that's when we have to fear the use of nuclear weapons, because Putin has made it very explicit that if that happens, he will consider the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Result, Mr. Biden, you can't have it both ways. You can't defeat Russia and avoid World War III.
Well, Ken, let's look at Taiwan, because we have seen Washington continually poking the hornet's nest there. And China has reiterated that Taiwan is its red line, just like it sounds very familiar when Russia continued to tell them what was their red line in the eastward movement of NATO. I mean, your thoughts on this side of things and where this could go, especially when we see various American officials visiting Taiwan, and they know, obviously, this is a very, very sensitive area for Beijing.
Well, there's no question that Taiwan is the key issue, the key concern. China has been very clear about this all along. This is a fundamental principle. There is only one China. Taiwan is part of China, which is, of course, actually the position of the local authorities on Taiwan as well. They just claim to be the ones that should be in charge, but that's a difference of opinion amongst the Chinese people. And all the way back in 1972, when President Nixon went to China, it was made very, very clear that the question of Taiwan was an internal question for the Chinese people on both sides of the straits to resolve in their own way and in their own time. And it is not the Chinese who have destabilized that situation. We hear, again, American politicians, most of whom probably can't find Taiwan on a map, saying things of a very provocative nature. We see the American government conducting activities, sending in military advisors, ramping up continually the level of arms sales and arms gifts to the local authorities on Taiwan, and the navigation sailings through the Taiwan Strait. These are things that are just blatantly in violation of not just the sort of principles of one China, but of explicit undertakings which the American government had made to reduce the level of military assistance, to reduce its engagement, to cease having diplomatic relations. And instead we have, the speakers of the House of Representatives, we have other delegations of American government figures going to Taiwan and making these public appearances and provocative statements. It's a very, very reckless and dangerous situation. And of course, it's driven it's driven largely by these deep structural issues that we were talking about earlier, but it's also driven by the nature of the American, the sort of bourgeois political system where politicians are constantly looking at the polls and constantly looking at the next electoral cycle. And all they care about is taking a sort of more macho than the other guy position.
Okay, stay with me, Ken, because I just have about just a minute left. Ray, your thoughts,
Sure
where do you see U.S.-China relations going? 30 seconds.
Well, I hope they're going to go to lowering tensions, and I hope they're going to go to a better engagement. But I just think we have to see what the cards actually show. Okay,
and Ray, same question.
I think one has to be aware of the yellow peril and racism as a main element in U.S. foreign policy. Unless that is faced into squarely, these Orientals, as General Westmoreland used to call them, are not placing the same value on life that we in the West do. In other words, there's a prejudice underlying all this stuff in Congress and everything else. We have to recognize that Orientals are just as human as people of my color.
All right. And on that note, thank you both for being with me. Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst out of Raleigh, North Carolina. Ken Hammond, professor of East Asian and Global History, New Mexico State University out of Boston. And all the way, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another program, another Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashemi signing off for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Hope to see you right here next time.